The afternoon sun streamed through Ben's workshop window, casting golden rays across scattered wood shavings. His calloused hands moved rhythmically against the oak grain when a sound shattered the peaceful silence, a coffee cup exploding against concrete. Across Main Street, two men in charcoal suits flanked a petite brunette, their grip firm on her trembling arms as they hauled her from Miller's Café. She wasn't fighting back, wasn't screaming, just silent tears carving paths down pale cheeks, her shoulders curved inward like a wounded bird. Ben had never laid eyes on her before, yet something about her quiet surrender pierced straight through his chest. The same helpless grace he'd watched slip away in a hospital room 2 years ago. His chisel clattered to the floor. "Touch my wife again, and you'll regret it." The lie rolled off his tongue before rational thought could intervene. Time froze. The woman's tear-filled gaze met his across the distance, and in those green depths he glimpsed something impossible. Recognition. The two men released their grip instantly, stepping back as if Ben's words carried some invisible authority. The taller one adjusted his tie nervously while his companion glanced around Main Street, suddenly aware of the curious onlookers gathering on sidewalks. Ben crossed the asphalt with measured steps, his work boots echoing against pavement still warm from September sun. Up close, the woman looked even more fragile. Bird-boned wrists, designer jeans that seemed too expensive for Millbrook's modest downtown, and those green eyes that held secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of mascara across pale skin. "Thank you," she whispered, voice barely audible above the distant hum of afternoon traffic. Her accent carried subtle hints of somewhere else, not quite southern, not quite coastal, but refined in ways that didn't match the small Connecticut town's usual rhythms. The shorter man muttered something about misunderstandings and family business, before both strangers retreated to a black sedan, parked illegally by the fire hydrant. Ben watched them drive away, their tinted windows reflecting nothing but sky. The woman stood there for a long moment, studying Ben's face with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "Why did you say I was your wife?" she asked finally. Her question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and impossible to grasp. Ben found himself staring at her hands, soft, unmarked by the kind of labor that had carved lines into his own palms since high school. Everything about her seemed to whisper of a world beyond sawdust and small-town simplicity. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty surprised him more than the lie had. Seemed like the right thing to say. Something flickered across her expression then. Relief, maybe, or recognition of kindness she hadn't expected to find on a random Tuesday afternoon in a place where she clearly didn't belong. She extended her hand with old-fashioned formality that seemed both natural and rehearsed. "Isabella," she said, and even her name sounded like it carried weight he couldn't understand. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop next door had been watching the whole scene unfold from behind her display window, and Ben knew by tomorrow morning the entire town would be buzzing with theories about the mysterious woman and her dramatic rescue. Millbrook thrived on such mysteries, especially ones involving Ben Carter, the widowed carpenter who'd kept to himself ever since Sarah's funeral 2 years ago. Ruby, his 8-year-old daughter, spent most afternoons at the workshop after school, but today she was at her friend Emma's house, spared from witnessing whatever strange drama had just played out on their quiet street. Ben had always been the type to mind his own business, fix what was broken, and leave complicated emotions locked away like tools he rarely needed. But as Isabella stood there in the afternoon light, something about her presence felt like a door opening in a house he'd thought was sealed forever. The rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to protect Ruby and himself from unexpected complications, whispered warnings about getting involved with strangers who attracted men in expensive suits and brought trouble to small towns. Sarah's memory lived in every corner of his workshop, from the half-finished jewelry box on his workbench to the faded photograph tucked behind his tool cabinet. She'd been his high school sweetheart, the girl who'd dreamed of opening an art gallery someday and filling it with paintings that captured the simple beauty of everyday moments. Cancer had stolen those dreams along with everything else, leaving Ben to raise Ruby alone in a house that still echoed with ghost laughter and might-have-beens. He'd made peace with solitude, or so he'd told himself during long nights when sleep wouldn't come. "I should go," Isabella said, glancing toward the workshop where afternoon shadows were growing longer. But she didn't move, didn't step away from whatever invisible thread seemed to connect them across the space of shared secrets. "Thank you again. I won't forget this." Her words carried weight that suggested she rarely forgot anything important, that kindness was a currency she'd learned to value because it came so rarely. Ben nodded, not trusting his voice to stay steady if he tried to speak. "I'm sorry about your coffee," he managed finally, gesturing toward the shattered ceramic still glittering on the sidewalk. Isabella's laugh was soft and unexpected, transforming her face from something fragile into something luminous. "It was terrible coffee anyway," she admitted. "Miller's Café isn't exactly known for their espresso." The comment revealed familiarity with the town that contradicted everything else about her. The designer clothes, the mysterious men, the way she held herself like someone accustomed to being watched and judged. As Isabella walked away down Main Street, her footsteps silent on worn concrete, Ben found himself wondering about the stories people carried and the masks they wore to hide their true selves. He returned to his workshop, but the wood seemed different under his hands now, less predictable, more alive with possibilities he'd forgotten existed. The afternoon sun continued its slow journey toward evening, casting new shadows across familiar tools and half-finished projects. Something had shifted in the ordered universe of his solitary life, like the first crack in ice that signals winter's end. The next morning brought Isabella back to his workshop, not with drama or crisis, but with the quiet determination of someone who'd made a decision in the dark hours before dawn. She carried a paper bag from Morton's bakery and 2 cups of coffee that actually smelled promising, not from Miller's Café, but from the new place that had opened near the highway. Ben was planing a piece of cherry wood for a custom cabinet, the rhythmic scrape of metal against grain providing soundtrack to the morning ritual he'd perfected over years of solitary work. "I thought maybe I could buy you breakfast," Isabella said, setting the bag on his workbench with careful precision that avoided disturbing his tools. "As a thank you." She wore different clothes today, jeans and a simple sweater that looked expensive, despite their apparent casualness, boots that had never seen real mud despite their rustic styling. Everything about her continued to whisper of a world where appearances mattered more than authenticity. Yet her gesture felt genuine in ways that surprised him. They ate in companionable silence, sitting on upended crates while morning light filtered through windows he'd been meaning to clean for months. Isabella studied his work with the kind of attention most people reserved for museum exhibits, asking questions that revealed unexpected knowledge about woodworking techniques and grain patterns. "My grandfather was a cabinet maker," she explained when Ben raised an eyebrow at her expertise. "He taught me to recognize quality craftsmanship." Her hands moved as she spoke, gesturing toward joints and finishes with familiarity that seemed both inherited and hard-won. Ruby arrived after school that afternoon to find Isabella still there, now wearing one of Ben's extra aprons while helping him organize hardware that had accumulated in coffee cans and mason jars over the years. His daughter stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in this unexpected disruption to their established routine with the careful assessment children used when their carefully ordered worlds shifted without warning. Isabella knelt to Ruby's eye level, introducing herself with the same formal politeness she'd shown Ben, waiting for the child's permission to enter their private space. "Are you going to be my new mom?" Ruby asked with the devastating directness that 8-year-olds wielded like precision instruments. The question hung in the workshop air, surrounded by sawdust motors dancing in afternoon light, while both adults struggled for appropriate responses. Isabella's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away from Ruby's steady gaze. "I'm just a friend," she said carefully. "Someone your dad helped when I needed it." Ruby nodded solemnly, seeming to accept this explanation while filing away information for future consideration. Over the following weeks, Isabella became a regular presence in their lives, arriving each morning with coffee and pastries, staying to help with small tasks that didn't require professional expertise but benefited from patient hands and careful attention. She never talked about the men who'd dragged her from Miller's Café, never explained why she'd appeared in their small town or how long she planned to stay. Ben found himself looking forward to her quiet company, the way she hummed under her breath while sorting screws by size, the questions she asked about his work that revealed genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. Ruby warmed to Isabella gradually, the way flowers opened to spring sun, slowly, then all at once. She began saving drawings from school to show their visitor, proud of gold stars and teacher comments that praised her artistic talent. Isabella praised each artwork with attention that went beyond adult politeness, pointing out specific details that showed she was really looking, really seeing what Ruby had created. "You have your mother's eye for color," she told Ruby one afternoon, studying a crayon drawing of their house surrounded by impossible purple trees. The comment stopped Ben cold, his plane frozen mid-stroke against the walnut board he'd been smoothing. He'd never mentioned Sarah to Isabella, never spoken about his wife's artistic dreams or the sketchbooks still tucked away in bedroom drawers like pressed flowers between book pages. "How do you know about her mother?" he asked quietly, aware that Ruby was listening with the sharp attention children brought to conversations about subjects adults usually kept private. Isabella's expression shifted, something guarded sliding across her features like shadows moving over water. "Lucky guess," she said, but her eyes didn't meet his directly. "Ruby has an artist's way of seeing the world. That usually comes from somewhere." The explanation felt both reasonable and insufficient, like trying to solve an equation with variables that kept changing value. Ben set down his tools and studied Isabella's face, looking for clues in the way she held her mouth, the tension around her eyes when she thought no one was watching. She'd been nothing but kind to them, nothing but helpful and present, yet something about her careful words suggested layers he hadn't even begun to discover. That evening, after Ruby had gone to bed with a new book Isabella had brought from the library in town, Ben found himself sitting across from their visitor at his kitchen table while coffee grew cold in mugs Sarah had picked out years ago. The domesticity of the scene should have felt natural, but instead it carried the weight of unspoken questions and careful omissions. Isabella traced patterns on the wooden table with her finger, following grain lines that Ben had learned to read like topographical maps of the tree's history. "Tell me about Sarah," she said finally, the request so quiet he almost missed it beneath the house's evening sounds. Settling boards, the hum of the refrigerator, Ruby's radio playing softly upstairs. Ben found himself talking about his wife for the first time since her funeral, sharing memories he'd kept locked away like photographs too precious to risk exposing to light. Sarah's laugh, the way she'd danced in the kitchen while cooking dinner, her dream of opening a gallery where local artists could show their work to people who understood that beauty existed in small towns just as much as in big cities. Isabella listened with the kind of attention that made speaking feel like a gift rather than a burden, asking questions that showed she understood the difference between missing someone and grieving for dreams that would never come true. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Isabella said when Ben's words finally trailed off into comfortable silence. "Ruby is lucky to carry her legacy." The comment felt like blessing and recognition rolled together, acknowledgement of something precious that death couldn't diminish. As autumn deepened into the kind of New England weather that turned leaves into stained glass windows, Isabella's presence in their lives began to feel less like a temporary blessing and more like a permanent gift. She helped Ruby with homework that stretched Ben's rusty math skills, taught her simple songs on the old piano that had been gathering dust in their living room since Sarah's death, and brought a lightness to their evening routines that felt like windows opening in a house that had been sealed too long. Ben found himself watching Isabella when she didn't know he was looking, cataloguing the small mysteries that accumulated like evidence of a larger truth he couldn't quite grasp. The way she automatically set the table with formal precision, as if muscle memory guided her hands toward patterns learned in childhood. Her knowledge of classical music and art history that went beyond casual appreciation. The fact that she never talked about family or friends from wherever she'd come from, never mentioned a job or responsibilities that might call her away from their small-town sanctuary. One evening in early November, while they were cleaning up after dinner, and Ruby was upstairs practicing piano with determined concentration, Isabella's phone buzzed against the kitchen counter, where she'd left it face down beside the dish towel. The sound startled her badly enough that she knocked over her water glass, sending liquid across the table in spreading puddles that soaked into the wood grain before Ben could grab paper towels to contain the damage. Her face went pale as winter sky, and her hands shook as she reached for the device. The caller ID showed only a number, but Isabella stared at it like it might explode if she looked too long. The phone stopped buzzing, then immediately started again. "I need to take this," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been fear or resignation, or both. She stepped outside onto the back porch, closing the door behind her with careful precision that suggested she didn't want to be overheard. Through the window, Ben could see her silhouette against the darkness, one hand pressed to her ear while the other gestured in sharp, controlled movements. When she came back inside 15 minutes later, her composure was restored but fragile, like ice reformed over water that had been churning moments before. "Everything okay?" Ben asked, keeping his voice casual while loading dishes into the dishwasher with movements that gave his hands something to do while he waited for her response. Isabella nodded too quickly, her smile too bright in the kitchen's warm light. "Just some business I need to handle," she said. "Nothing important." But her fingers drummed against the countertop in patterns that suggested anxiety, and she kept glancing toward the phone, as if expecting it to ring again. That night, long after Isabella had gone back to the small apartment she'd rented above Preston's hardware store, Ben lay awake thinking about the fear he'd seen in her eyes and the careful way she'd avoided his questions. Ruby's breathing was soft and steady from the room next door, the sound of a child who felt safe and loved in a world that made sense to her. He'd worked hard to maintain that sense of security since Sarah's death, building routines and boundaries that protected them both from unexpected complications and painful surprises. But Isabella had slipped past those defenses with her quiet presence and genuine kindness, becoming part of their daily rhythm in ways that felt both natural and impossible. Ben found himself hoping she would stay, even as logic warned him that people with secrets rarely stayed anywhere long enough to let those secrets catch up with them. The thought of explaining her departure to Ruby made his chest tight with protective anxiety. But the thought of losing Isabella's company made him realize how much he'd begun to depend on her presence in ways he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. The next morning brought unseasonably warm November sunshine and Isabella's familiar knock on the workshop door, but something had changed in the night's small hours. She moved with careful precision that suggested she was holding herself together through conscious effort, and her usual easy conversation felt strained around edges that hadn't existed the day before. Ben worked quietly at his bench, sanding a jewelry box he'd been crafting for Ruby's Christmas present, while Isabella sorted through a box of brass hinges with attention that seemed forced rather than natural. "Ben," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of words she'd been rehearsing since dawn. "I need to tell you something." The sentence landed in the workshop's peaceful atmosphere like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the morning routine they'd established over weeks of shared silences and comfortable companionship. Ben set down his sandpaper and gave her his full attention, preparing himself for whatever revelation had been building behind her careful smiles and deflected questions. "Those men you saw at Miller's Café," Isabella began, then stopped, looking around the workshop as if memorizing details she might not see again. "They weren't strangers. They work for my family." The admission came out in a rush, followed by silence so complete Ben could hear Ruby's school bus rumbling down Main Street 3 blocks away. Isabella's hands twisted in her lap, and when she looked up at him, her green eyes held the same desperate honesty he'd seen that first afternoon when she'd thanked him for his unexpected intervention. "My real name is Isabella Williams," she continued, and even this simple statement carried weight that suggested layers of complication Ben was only beginning to understand. "My family owns Williams Heritage Foundation. We manage art collections and cultural endowments for wealthy families and institutions." The words came out in measured cadences that sounded practiced, as if she'd given this explanation before to people who needed to understand the scope of her world. "I'm supposed to be in Manhattan right now, preparing for a board meeting about acquisitions worth more money than this entire town sees in a year." Ben absorbed this information slowly, fitting it against everything he'd observed about Isabella over the weeks she'd been part of their lives. Her knowledge of art and craftsmanship, the expensive clothes worn with casual indifference, the way she moved through the world as if accustomed to attention and deference. "Why aren't you there?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral while his mind raced through implications he was only beginning to grasp. "Why are you here, sorting hardware in a small-town workshop?" Isabella's laugh held no humor, just the bitter recognition of someone who'd been asking herself the same question for weeks. "Because I couldn't breathe there," she said simply. "Because every conversation was about profit margins and market values, and nobody cared about the artists who created the work we bought and sold like commodities. Because I looked around that conference room filled with people wearing suits that cost more than most families' annual income, and I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if finally naming her dissatisfaction gave it power and legitimacy. "So you ran away," Ben said, and it wasn't a question. Isabella nodded, accepting the characterization without attempting to soften it with more flattering language. "I told them I needed time to think about a major acquisition decision. They gave me 2 weeks. That was 6 weeks ago." The timeline explained the phone calls, the careful way she'd avoided talking about her life before Millbrook, the underlying tension that had surrounded her like invisible armor even during their most relaxed moments together. "What happens now?" Ben asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the resignation in her posture and the way she'd been looking around his workshop like someone saying goodbye. Isabella stood and walked to the window that looked out over Main Street, where normal people were going about their normal lives without the weight of family expectations and inherited obligations pressing down on their shoulders like physical burdens. "I have to go back," she said to the glass, her reflection wavering in the morning light. The board meeting is next Monday. There are contracts worth millions of dollars waiting for my signature, and people whose livelihoods depend on decisions I'm supposed to make." She turned back to face him, and Ben saw tears she was fighting to control. "I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to get attached to a life I can't keep." The workshop fell silent, except for the steady tick of the clock Sarah had given him for their 5th wedding anniversary, marking time that suddenly felt precious and fleeting. Ben understood now why Isabella had been so careful not to make promises about staying, why she'd always seemed to be holding something back even during their most intimate conversations. "What about Ruby?" he asked, voicing the concern that cut deeper than his own disappointment. "How do I explain to an 8-year-old that you were just passing through?" Isabella's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she struggled for words that would make this easier for all of them. "Tell her I had to go help my family," she said finally. "Tell her that sometimes grown-ups have responsibilities they can't walk away from, even when they want to." The explanation would have to be enough, Ben realized, because the truth was too complicated for a child who'd already lost one important woman in her life. That afternoon, Isabella said goodbye to Ruby with hugs and promises to write letters that they both knew would eventually stop coming. As new responsibilities and old routines erased the memory of their brief time together. She gave Ruby a small painting she'd been working on in secret, a watercolor portrait of their house surrounded by the purple trees from Ruby's drawing, signed with careful letters that spelled out words of love and encouragement. Ruby accepted the gift with solemn dignity that broke Ben's heart, already understanding at some level that this was an ending rather than a beginning. After Isabella left for the last time, driving away in a silver sedan that belonged to the world she'd tried to escape, Ben and Ruby fell back into their old routines with the hollow efficiency of people who'd learned that survival meant accepting loss without fighting against its inevitability. They ate dinner at the kitchen table where Isabella's place-setting felt like an accusation, watched television programs that no longer seemed entertaining, and went through the motions of their evening rituals while carefully avoiding conversations about absence and disappointment. Ben threw himself into work with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun his own thoughts, accepting custom orders that would keep his hands busy through the long winter months ahead. Ruby drew pictures that gradually stopped including purple trees and started focusing on more realistic subjects: their house as it actually appeared, their cat sleeping in patches of sunlight, still lifes of fruit and flowers that suggested she was learning to see the world with less magical thinking and more practical acceptance. 3 months passed like scenes from a movie played at the wrong speed, too slow to be engaging, too fast to allow for proper processing of everything that had changed and been lost again. Ben learned to wake up without expecting to hear Isabella's voice in his workshop, learned to shop for groceries without automatically buying the herbal tea she'd preferred over coffee in the afternoons. Ruby stopped asking when Isabella might visit and began talking about school friends and upcoming spring activities with the resilience of children who adapted to disappointment by moving forward rather than looking back. Then Ruby got sick with flu symptoms that escalated beyond normal childhood illnesses, spiking fevers and breathing difficulties that sent Ben racing to the emergency room at 3 a.m, with his daughter limp and frightening in his arms. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of medical procedures and specialist consultations, Ben sleeping in hospital chairs while Ruby fought through complications that reminded him too much of Sarah's final weeks. His daughter recovered, but slowly, requiring weeks of careful monitoring and gradual return to normal activities. It was during Ruby's convalescence, when Ben was exhausted from juggling work and caretaking responsibilities, that Isabella appeared at his workshop door without warning or explanation. She looked different, thinner, more serious, wearing clothes that suggested she'd driven straight from her other life without stopping to change into the casual attire she'd favored during her previous stay in Millbrook. "I heard Ruby was sick," she said simply, as if 3 months and a world of unspoken complications hadn't passed since their last conversation. "How did you hear?" Ben asked, though he was too tired to feel suspicious and too grateful for her presence to question the logic of her return. Isabella stepped into the workshop and looked around at projects that had accumulated in her absence, tools that had been reorganized according to purely functional principles rather than the aesthetic arrangements she'd preferred. "Mrs. Patterson has a cousin who works at the hospital," she explained. "Word travels faster than you'd think between small towns and big cities when it involves people someone cares about. You came back," Ben said, stating the obvious because more complex observations felt beyond his emotional capacity after weeks of worry and sleepless nights. Isabella nodded, setting down a bag of what looked like medical supplies and comfort items chosen by someone who understood both practical needs and the small luxuries that helped healing feel less like punishment. "I couldn't stay away," she admitted. "Not when Ruby needed help and you were trying to handle everything alone." Over the following weeks, Isabella settled back into their lives with the careful determination of someone who'd made peace with difficult decisions and their consequences. She didn't talk about what arrangements she'd made with her family or how she'd managed to step away from responsibilities that had seemed non-negotiable 3 months earlier. Instead, she focused on Ruby's recovery with attention that went beyond temporary assistance, learning the schedules of medications and follow-up appointments, cooking meals that tempted a child's diminished appetite back to normal enthusiasm for food. Ruby accepted Isabella's return with the pragmatic relief of someone who'd learned not to question good fortune too closely, afraid that too much analysis might make it disappear again. She shared stories about everything that had happened during Isabella's absence, from school projects to new friends to the scary parts of being sick that she'd been too brave to discuss with Ben. Isabella listened to all of it with patience that seemed infinite, offering comfort and encouragement without trying to fix problems that simply needed to be acknowledged and survived. As spring arrived with its promise of renewal and fresh beginnings, Ben began to understand that Isabella's return represented something different from her original arrival in their lives. She'd chosen them this time with full knowledge of what the choice would cost her, accepting limitations and complications rather than running away from responsibilities that felt incompatible with authentic happiness. They didn't discuss the future in concrete terms, but the changes she made, forwarding her mail to Ben's address, buying a reliable car suitable for small-town living, enrolling in a correspondence program that would let her consult for art organizations while remaining physically present in Millbrook, suggested permanence rather than temporary refuge. The jewelry box Ben had been making for Ruby's Christmas present became a project all 3 of them worked on together, Isabella contributing delicate painted details while Ruby chose the fabric for the interior compartments. The finished piece was more beautiful than anything Ben could have created alone, combining his technical expertise with Isabella's artistic vision and Ruby's innocent joy in collaborative creation. When they presented it to Ruby on a random Tuesday evening in April, she hugged them both with fierce appreciation that had nothing to do with the gift itself and everything to do with the sense of family that had grown around their shared work. They were building something together now, not just recovering from separate losses or running away from disappointing realities, but actively choosing each day to create a life that honored both practical needs and deeper longings for connection and purpose. Isabella established a small studio in the spare bedroom upstairs, where she worked on paintings and consulting projects that let her contribute to the art world without sacrificing her presence in the community she'd grown to love. Ben found himself taking on more creative projects, custom furniture that challenged his skills while allowing him to create beauty rather than just function. Ruby thrived in the atmosphere of quiet creativity and mutual support, her own artistic abilities blossoming under Isabella's gentle guidance and Ben's steady encouragement. She entered a regional art competition with a painting of their house that incorporated elements from all their different perspectives: Ben's appreciation for structural integrity, Isabella's eye for color and composition, and her own magical interpretation of ordinary spaces, transformed by love and attention. The painting won second place, earning Ruby a small scholarship for art classes and recognition that felt like validation of everything they'd built together over the past year. At the awards ceremony, sitting between Ben and Isabella in folding chairs set up in the high school gymnasium, Ruby whispered that she wanted to be an artist when she grew up, just like her mom had dreamed of being, and just like Isabella was now. That evening, as they celebrated Ruby's achievement with dinner at the nicest restaurant in the neighboring town, Ben realized that he hadn't thought about Sarah in terms of loss and absence for weeks. His wife's memory remained present in their lives, but transformed from source of grief into foundation for gratitude and ongoing love. Isabella had never tried to replace Sarah or compete with her legacy. Instead, she'd helped Ben and Ruby expand their understanding of family to include new forms of love that didn't diminish what came before. The music box Sarah had given him years ago still played its familiar melody each evening at 6 o'clock, but now it served as signal for family dinner rather than reminder of solitary grief. Isabella had learned to cook Sarah's favorite recipes from the handwritten cards tucked into kitchen drawers, not to erase the past, but to honor it while building something new and equally meaningful. Ruby set the table with careful attention to details Isabella had taught her, using Sarah's china on special occasions and everyday dishes with equal reverence for the rituals that made ordinary moments feel significant. As summer approached with its promise of long afternoons and lazy evenings, Ben found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to imagine since Sarah's death. Not the desperate planning of someone trying to control outcomes, but the quiet anticipation of someone who'd learned to trust that love could survive loss and grow stronger rather than weaker when shared with people who understood both its power and its fragility. One evening in late June, as they sat on the front porch watching Ruby chase fireflies in the yard, while cricket songs provided soundtrack to the day's gentle ending, Isabella leaned against Ben's shoulder with comfortable intimacy that no longer felt borrowed or temporary. "Thank you," she said quietly, her words almost lost beneath the sounds of summer evening in a small town where extraordinary things happened between ordinary people who were brave enough to recognize love when it appeared in unexpected forms. "For what?" Ben asked, though he thought he knew the answer from the contentment in her voice and the way she'd settled into their life like someone who'd finally found where she belonged after years of searching in places that offered everything except what she actually needed. Isabella was quiet for so long he thought she might have fallen asleep against his shoulder, but then she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to value words too much to waste them on anything less than truth. "For showing me that family isn't something you're born into or something you lose when people die," she said. "It's something you choose to build with people who love you enough to let you be exactly who you are, even when who you are is complicated and comes with baggage from worlds that don't understand what you need to be happy." Her observation hung in the warm air between them, accompanied by Ruby's delighted laughter as she caught another firefly in cupped palms before releasing it back into the gathering darkness. Ben didn't respond immediately, understanding that some truths were too important to acknowledge with casual words or automatic reassurances. Instead, he tightened his arm around Isabella's shoulders and watched their daughter, because that's what Ruby had become to Isabella, just as Isabella had become the mother Ruby needed. Celebrate the simple magic of summer evening in a place where love had room to grow, in directions none of them could have predicted or planned. The workshop window glowed with warm light from the lamp, Ben had left burning over his current project, a rocking chair he was crafting for the covered porch, where they spent most of their evening hours now that the weather was warm enough for sitting outside and watching the world settle into peaceful darkness. Tomorrow would bring its own small challenges and ordinary blessings, but tonight offered the perfect completeness of family dinner and shared stories, of fireflies and cricket songs, and the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to be fully present with each other without needing constant entertainment or distraction. Ruby ran up the porch steps with grass stains on her knees and joy shining in her face, ready to share discoveries about insect behavior and theories about where fireflies went during the day and whether they remembered the children who caught them gently before setting them free. Ben and Isabella made room for her between them on the porch swing, 3 people who'd found each other through circumstances none of them could have engineered, but all of them had learned to treasure as evidence that the universe sometimes arranged itself in favor of love rather than loss, hope rather than resignation, and the kinds of happy endings that grew slowly from daily choices to stay present and keep building something beautiful together. Why Pine Ridge? The question had been eating at him since Webb's visit, since learning that Alexandra's presence in their town hadn't been the accident she'd claimed. Because you were here. The answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. I've been following your career since Seattle. What happened to your wife? How you left firefighting? Where you ended up? When I needed to disappear for a while, this seemed like the right place. It was another lie, or maybe the first complete truth she'd told him. Either way, it changed everything. The revelation that she'd come to Pine Ridge specifically because of him recontextualized every interaction they'd shared. The convenient plumbing emergency, the perfect timing of their meetings, her knowledge of emergency protocols. All of it had been orchestrated by someone with the resources to research his background and stage encounters that felt natural. You played me, he said, and the words tasted like ash. From the very beginning, everything was manipulation. Alexandra turned to face him fully, her blue eyes bright with unshed tears. It started that way. I won't lie to you anymore, Ethan. I came here because I was curious about the man who'd sacrificed everything to save strangers. But staying, falling in love with you and Zoe, wanting to build something real, that was never part of any plan. Her voice broke slightly on the last words. I've never been as happy as I was these past few weeks, pretending to be someone who could belong in your world. You didn't have to pretend. The words came out before he could stop them, carrying more truth than he'd intended to reveal. The woman who taught Zoe origami and fixed my coffee maker and showed up to help save children, that person was real, regardless of your bank account. Alexandra's smile was sad and beautiful, and full of the kind of regret that came from understanding how completely they'd misunderstood each other. Was she? Because I'm not sure I know the difference between Alexandra Hamilton and Alex from Pine Ridge anymore. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Webb and his security team. The black SUVs pulled up with the same coordinated precision they'd shown before, but this time Webb emerged with the grim efficiency of someone who'd run out of patience for subtle approaches. He surveyed the scene. Alexandra in tactical gear sitting beside a soot-covered plumber, while media crews captured every moment. And his expression suggested that subtle diplomacy was no longer on the table. Mrs. Hamilton, this has gone far enough. Webb's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience from people who controlled billion-dollar corporations. The board has expressed serious concerns about your recent behavior. Your presence here today, putting yourself at risk for a publicity stunt, demonstrates exactly the kind of poor judgment we've been discussing. His dismissal of the rescue as a publicity stunt was calculated to wound, and Ethan felt Alexandra flinch beside him. It wasn't a publicity stunt, Ethan said, standing to put himself between Webb and Alexandra. She helped save 4 people, including my daughter. Whatever else is true, that matters. Webb's smile was sharp and cold, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Mr. Blake, I'm afraid your opinion is irrelevant here. Miss Hamilton has responsibilities that extend far beyond your small-town concerns. She'll be returning to Seattle immediately for evaluation and treatment." "Treatment for what?" Alexandra's voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the undercurrent of fear. Webb pulled out a tablet and began reading from what was obviously a prepared statement. "The board has voted to invoke the mental health clause in your employment contract. Your recent behavior, abandoning corporate responsibilities, engaging in dangerous activities, forming inappropriate personal relationships, demonstrates a clear pattern of psychological distress requiring professional intervention. The corporate coup was happening in real time, disguised as concern for Alexandra's well-being, but obviously designed to remove her from power while she was vulnerable." Ethan had seen enough workplace politics to recognize a hostile takeover when it wore a psychiatric mask. "You can't just kidnap someone because you don't like their personal choices," he said, though he suspected that someone with Webb's resources probably could do exactly that. "We're not kidnapping anyone," Webb replied with the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "Ms. Hamilton will voluntarily submit to evaluation, or the board will be forced to declare her incompetent and assume direct control of her assets. Either way, her association with this situation ends today." The threat was elegantly simple: cooperate or lose everything. It was the kind of choice that wasn't really a choice at all. Alexandra stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone approaching a dangerous animal. "How long have you been planning this, Marcus? Since I refused your advice about the Portland acquisition. Since I started asking questions about the defense contracts." Her voice was steady, but Ethan could see her hands shaking slightly. Webb's expression didn't change, but something satisfied flickered in his eyes. "The board simply wants what's best for the company, Ms. Hamilton. Your recent instability has made decisive action necessary." "Give me 24 hours, Alexandra said suddenly. "To wrap up my affairs here, say goodbye properly. Then I'll come back willingly and submit to whatever evaluation you want." Webb considered the request with the calculating expression of someone weighing risks and benefits. 12 hours, and you'll remain under security supervision to ensure your safety." The negotiation was over before it started, the outcome predetermined by superior resources and legal positioning. As Webb's team prepared to leave, Alexandra caught Ethan's arm with desperate intensity. "Take care of yourself and Zoe. Don't let them make you feel guilty for being a hero." The words were clearly meant as goodbye, but they carried an undercurrent that suggested this wasn't over. "What about you?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I'll figure something out. I always do." Her smile was brave and heartbreaking and completely unconvincing. That evening, after the media crews had moved on to other stories and Pine Ridge had returned to its normal quiet rhythm, Ethan sat on his back porch with Zoe beside him. She'd been unusually subdued since the morning's events, processing the reality that the woman who'd become part of their family was about to disappear from their lives. "Is Alex in trouble, Dad?" The question was careful, the way children asked about things they sensed were too complicated for simple answers. "Yeah, kiddo, I think she is." Ethan pulled Zoe closer, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with the lingering smoke from the school fire. "Sometimes when people have a lot of money and power, other people try to control them. Alex is dealing with that kind of problem right now." It was a simplified explanation, but Zoe was smart enough to understand the basic injustice of the situation. "Can't we help her?" Zoe's voice carried the same determination that had kept her calm during the fire rescue. "I mean, she helped save me today. Doesn't that mean we should help save her?" The question was so perfectly logical, so beautifully simple in its moral clarity, that Ethan felt something shift inside his chest. She was right, of course. Alexandra had risked her life to help save children, including his daughter, The least he could do was try to return the favor. "Maybe we can, kiddo. Let me think about it." But even as he said the words, Ethan wasn't sure what help he could offer against corporate lawyers and security teams with unlimited resources. He was a small-town plumber who'd once been a firefighter. What could someone like him do against people who controlled billion-dollar companies and had the law on their side? The answer came at 3 a.m. when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Alexandra's voice was whisper-quiet, obviously trying not to be overheard. "Ethan, I need you to listen carefully. Webb's people are planning something for tomorrow that goes beyond just taking me back to Seattle. They've been embezzling from company pension funds, using my absence to cover their tracks. I have evidence, but I need to get it to the FBI before they can discredit me completely. Where are you?" He was already reaching for his clothes, his mind automatically shifting into emergency response mode. "The Hamilton cabin on Glacier Lake. They think I'm sedated, but I palmed the pills. I've got maybe an hour before they realize I'm not unconscious." Her voice was steady but urgent, the tone of someone operating on borrowed time. "Ethan, you don't have to do this. I got myself into this mess. Zoe's at her friend Sarah's house for a sleepover. I can be there in 40 minutes. The decision felt automatic, like muscle memory from a life when helping people in danger was his job rather than his choice. "What do you need me to do?" Alexandra's relief was audible even through the phone connection. "Just get me to the FBI field office in Missoula. I've got everything we need to put Webb and his people away, but only if I can stay free long enough to deliver it." The drive to Glacier Lake took 35 minutes of careful navigation on mountain roads, designed more for scenery than speed. The Hamilton cabin turned out to be a sprawling log structure that probably cost more than most people's houses, set on a private peninsula with helicopter access and enough security equipment to protect a small country. Alexandra was waiting in the tree line, dressed in dark clothes and carrying a backpack that looked like it held more than vacation supplies. "How did you get past the security?" Ethan asked as she slipped into his truck with the fluid movements of someone accustomed to moving quietly in dangerous situations. "I designed most of their systems when I was trying to upgrade company security. Turns out knowing how something works makes it easier to circumvent." Her smile was grim but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd just outmaneuvered people who'd underestimated her capabilities. The drive to Missoula normally took 2 hours, but they made it in 90 minutes of careful driving on back roads that avoided main highways and traffic cameras. Alexandra spent the time on her laptop, compiling evidence files and sending encrypted copies to journalists and federal investigators. "Insurance," she explained when Ethan asked about the multiple transmissions. "If something happens to us, at least the truth will get out." The FBI field office was a nondescript building in downtown Missoula that could have housed any government agency or corporate headquarters. Special Agent Jennifer Torres met them in the parking garage, a woman in her 40s with the kind of alert competence that came from years of dealing with white-collar crime. "Ms. Hamilton, we've been hoping you'd contact us. Your assistant reached out 3 weeks ago with some interesting allegations about financial irregularities at your company. The meeting that followed was a masterclass in federal investigation techniques. Agent Torres and her team went through Alexandra's evidence with the methodical precision of people who'd built careers on attention to detail. Financial records, email communications, recorded phone calls. Years of carefully documented proof that Webb and several board members had been systematically looting Hamilton Industries while positioning themselves to take control of the company. "This is enough for multiple indictments," Torres said after reviewing the core evidence files. "Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, probably RICO charges if we can prove the pattern extends far enough. You've done excellent work documenting this, Ms. Hamilton." Alexandra's relief was obvious, though she tried to maintain the composed facade that probably served her well in boardroom negotiations. "What happens now?" "Now we arrest the people responsible, and you go back to running your company." Torres replied, with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed taking down financial criminals. We'll coordinate with Seattle PD to execute warrants simultaneously. Webb and his associates will be in custody before they realize what's happening. It was the kind of swift justice that rarely happened in corporate crime cases, made possible by Alexandra's meticulous documentation and willingness to cooperate. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt different than their desperate escape 12 hours earlier. Alexandra was quiet, staring out the window at the Montana landscape she'd grown to love during her brief time as a small-town tourist. "What will you do now?" Ethan asked as they reached the outskirts of town. "Go back to being a billionaire CEO, I suppose. Try to rebuild a company that almost got destroyed by people I trusted. That's not what I meant." He pulled over at the scenic overlook where Pine Ridge spread out below them like a postcard of small-town America. "What will you do about us? About this?" His gesture encompassed the space between them, the complicated relationship that had survived lies and corporate conspiracies, and the kind of dramatic rescues that belonged in movies rather than real life. Alexandra turned to face him fully, her blue eyes serious but hopeful. "I was thinking about what Zoe said yesterday, about helping people who helped us. Maybe it's time for Hamilton Industries to open a rural development office, somewhere in Montana, focused on supporting small towns that need investment but not exploitation." Her smile was tentative but genuine. Of course, that would require someone to run the Montana operations, someone who understands small-town life and emergency management and how to make complicated things simple. "Are you offering me a job?" The question came out more amused than surprised. After everything they'd been through, the idea of Alexandra trying to solve their relationship problems with corporate solutions was perfectly in character. "I'm offering you a partnership, professional and personal, if you're interested. No more lies, no more pretending to be someone else. Just Alexandra and Ethan figuring out how to build something real together." The offer was tempting and terrifying in equal measure. Working with Alexandra would mean leaving his simple life as Pine Ridge's only plumber, stepping into a world of corporate responsibility and public attention that had already proven dangerous. But it would also mean building something meaningful with someone who'd proven she was willing to risk everything for the people she loved. "What about Zoe?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Zoe comes with us, obviously. There are excellent schools in Seattle, or we could arrange for remote learning if she wants to stay in Montana. Whatever works best for her." Alexandra's planning was thorough and thoughtful, the approach of someone who'd learned to consider all stakeholders in any major decision. "I've gotten used to having both of you in my life. I'm not interested in going back to a world where that's not possible." 6 months later, Ethan stood in the main conference room of Hamilton Industries' new Rural Development Division, looking out at the Missoula skyline while reviewing grant applications from small towns across the Mountain West. The Montana office had become everything Alexandra had promised, a way to use corporate resources to support communities that needed help without losing their character. It was meaningful work that combined his emergency management background with Alexandra's business expertise and engineering knowledge. Zoe adapted to their new life with the resilience that had carried her through her mother's death and her father's career change. She split her time between Missoula's advanced STEM programs and weekend trips to Pine Ridge, where she maintained her friendships and her position on the soccer team. Their family had grown and evolved in ways that honored the past while embracing possibilities they'd never imagined when Alexandra was just Alex from out of town. The romantic relationship between Ethan and Alexandra developed slowly, built on the foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect, rather than the dramatic intensity of their first meeting. They worked together during the day and went home to their respective houses in the evening, dating like normal adults rather than characters in an adventure movie. It was ordinary and domestic, and occasionally wonderful in ways that felt sustainable rather than exhausting. On quiet Sunday evenings, when Zoe was doing homework and Alexandra was reading business journals, Ethan sometimes played his harmonica on the back deck of their Missoula house. The music drifted across the neighborhood, mixing with the sounds of normal family life, dinnertime conversations, television programs, children playing in backyards. It was the kind of simple happiness he'd stopped believing was possible after Anna's death, proof that love could indeed be built on honesty and shared purpose rather than rescue and crisis. The harmonica that had once represented guilt and loss had become something else entirely, a bridge between past and future, a reminder that music could heal even the deepest wounds when it was played with patience and hope. Anna would have approved, he thought. She'd always believed that the best way to honor the dead was to keep living, to find new forms of love that didn't diminish what came before, but simply added new melodies to the ongoing song of a life well lived.